Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the first chapter of the book of Acts, more formally known as the Acts of Apostles, but we're going to refer to it as Acts from here on. And we're just going to delve into some literary context before we analyze the text itself. Proceeding from the macrocosm, in the New Testament, Acts is in a category of one, so to speak. Only Revelation and Acts can claim that distinction. Now, the first four books of the New Testament are Gospels, which are not strictly speaking biographical works, though they do have the protagonist, but the emphasis is really on the Messiah's mortal ministry. And the book of Acts is classified as history, and in the Old Testament, I think there's 17 books classified as such, but there's only one in the New Testament. This documents it begins in the first chapter with the ascension, post-resurrection. We're going to get into that. And then documents the rise or spread of the church or assembly throughout a 30-year period. And then after that comes the Pauline epistles. Now, the epistles are not arranged in the chronological order they were written. They mostly are arranged. Paul, he was a church planter of sorts, so he addressed individual assemblies, and whereas the ones that come after him are classified as general epistles. They're spoken to no one in particular, and that's not to say that there's not an application for us. Everything in the Bible was not necessarily written to us, but it is written for us. And then it concludes with Revelation. That's at the end times. And I also forgot to mention that Paul has pastoral epistles in between letters written to individuals. So that just reiterates the point that it was written to someone with someone else in mind, but preserved for us so we can benefit from it. Now, in the book of Acts itself, the first 13 chapters generally are known as Peter's, largely revolve around the works of Peter. Then Paul assumes the lead. And a significant turning point occurs in verse 16:10, where we read the word we. So that means that Luke, the author of this book, also an author of one of the Gospels that bears his name, was intimately involved and was personally witnessing the acts that he recorded. And but the first chapter really opens with we often speak of the death, burial, and resurrection, but there's a fourth tier to that too. That's known as the ascension. So after he was resurrected, the Messiah, for 40 days, he ascended to heaven, and that's the ultimate. Now, when we're resurrected, we'll go instantaneously to heaven, but he ministered to his disciples, and we see a remarkable transformation during this period. Now, in the Gospels, the 12 people he ministered to in mutual proximity. These were his main lieutenants, so to speak, for lack of a better word. But they're referred to as disciples, which is broadly speaking a general term for followers, of not necessarily limited to any religious leader or anything. But apostles, the transformation into apostles is really a profound transformation. We see them, they're fearful, they're doubtful, they're cowardly at times, they jockey amongst themselves, and they really have a misconstrued idea of what the nature of the kingdom is. And the gospel, poignantly, it doesn't conceal any of their warts and all. We can profit from their mistakes and be similarly transformed. So we're going to jump into the text itself. Now, the first verse reads, "The first account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Yahshua began both to do and to teach." Now, the first account is a reference to the Gospel of Luke, which he wrote, bears his name. And a lot of scholars see this as a continuation of it, because that documents the book of Luke is it contains, besides Matthew, it has an infancy narrative, and it also contains something we don't see. Mark and John focus exclusively on the 3-year ministry, which began when he was 30, culminated on the cross when he was 33. But we see a glimpse of the young Messiah at age 12 in the temple. Now, Theophilus, that translates as lover of God in Greek. Now, there's different scholarly schools of thought. Some are inclined to interpret it as an individual. Others are inclined to interpret it as a broad meaning. Now, whether he wrote this to an individual or to lovers in God in general, that was clearly his target audience. So I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't have any way of historically verifying if he actually wrote this to an individual, whereas Titus and Timothy and Philemon are distinctly marked as such. All we have to work in, and to do and to teach. Now, doing and teaching. Now, the book of Mark really documents it's an action-oriented account. It doesn't focus so much on his teachings, but there's a lot on the miracles. But the teachings, the other three accounts contain a more balanced equilibrium of his doings and teachings, and both are essential and important. That's not to ridicule or dismiss Mark. Each has their own contribution. But interesting bit of trivia, Acts is 28 chapters, which forms the longest chapter-wise book of the New Testament, but Luke is 24 chapters, but actually contains the most material. But that's just a bit of trivia. Until the day when he was taken up, after giving instructions through the Ruach Kadesh to the emissaries whom he had chosen. Now, taken up is a reference to the ascension. So he died, buried, and was resurrected. Now, they thought death had defeated him, and they're initially perplexed. And we actually read of an original encounter in Luke's 24th chapter, which is the final chapter of his account, where he questions these two disciples of his walking on the road, and lo and behold, they find out it's him as he begins, and he expounds on his the ministry and nature of it through the Old Testament. Ruach Kadesh, I've explained this other times, that's the Hebrew translation of what is erroneously known as the Holy Spirit. Long story short, the word holy is an artificial manufacturing invented by the Catholic Church, derived from the second syllable of their word. The word more accurately translates as set apart or sanctified or distinct. And the emissaries is just this translation that's alternately apostles. So that's the 12, the ones who had the intimate eyewitness, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them for 40 days, speaking concerning the kingdom of Elohim. Now, this came after his suffering. That's a reference to the cross. The crucifixion was the worst pain anyone could ever endure. And it's not just the physical pain alone, but the spiritual separation from his Father. He literally became the sin. He bore what we are. He bore our penalty for us. And infallible proof sounds suspiciously scientific for pre-scientific text. Now, our modern mindsets are inclined to associate the word with that which can be empirically verified. Yet eyewitness, they were empirically verified, but we have no way of seeing what they saw. So we must rely on the character of the witness, and we have to accept the veracity of it on faith, which ultimately can be, a lot of scientifically minded people think that religion or spiritual matters is for the tender-minded, but it's actually larger leap of knowledge to faith, to believe what you don't see. That's not where, our belief is to have an object. It's to be centered around something of substance if it's to have any meaning. So it's not blind faith itself, but we trust them because the character of their witness, and all of them were willing to die for the witness. Every single one of them, except with the exception of the Apostle John, no one willingly dies for a lie. They all took the resurrected to the grave, and because of that, they will be resurrected. And meeting with them, he commanded them not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which you have heard from me. Because John truly baptized in water, but you shall be baptized in the Ruach Kadesh not many days from now. So this is a lot of what Christians refer to as the Trinity, the Son speaking of the Father, fulfilling the promise, which is the third member of what is commonly known as the Trinity, the Spirit, who he designates as his successor. So it was ultimately more value in that his body was located to one physical location at once, but now a divine presence would be able to accompany them and assist them throughout all their endeavors, not limited by geographical parameters or location. So the Spirit it is wherever you ask for it. If you ask in faith and sincerity of intention, it can it's a comforter and a guider into truth. And John mentioned in the gospel accounts that one who is coming after me, would baptize with fire, by which is meant baptism into salvation. That's what we understand the fire to mean. It's to be of a qualitatively more than merely symbolic significance of the water through which we signal our identification in the death, burial, and resurrection. We follow his model as he did it, and that's just something we do because he modeled it. He was without sin, but he was ultimately our example. And even though he didn't need it, he assumed it. So when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Master, would you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And this is an ask and answer, verse 6 and verse 7. And he said to them, It is not for you to know the times or season which the Father has put in his own authority. So they still have a little bit of that lingering skepticism or the curiosity for things that are maybe not meant for them to know. Now, when the Son was in the flesh, incidentally, he said that even he didn't know the hour when it would come. Now, whether he was privy to this time or not at this time is ultimately a speculative matter. Now, the divine human duality poses some interesting questions because he had all the attributes of the Father, infinite love, yet he didn't, strictly speaking, have omniscience. He said you could move mountains by faith, yet you nailed him in the cross and he'll die. So he had all the infirmities of flesh. But he also didn't know everything by his own admission. He didn't know the hour when he was to return, at least in his present human mindset. But this is a resurrected being, so it's ultimately a matter of speculation. And the important thing for us to extract is that we don't know. So we're to spend each day as if it could come tomorrow, yet live the rest of our lives like we're working towards the kingdom. But you shall receive power when the Ruach Kadesh has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judah and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So the end of that verse is really the geoconcentric circles through which they're to expand. They're to ultimately grow from essentially a mustard seed to a tree of faith that'll eventually cover the whole world. And Samaria we read in Acts 8, was evangelized by Philip, and that was there was mutually bitter animosity between them and the Jews. But the whole world, this made them distinct from the Jewish religion in that they were to be pan-national from its inception. And Paul and the whole world, interesting story, though. If it wasn't for the evangelical efforts of St. Patrick, who evangelized Ireland, it is argued that Western civilization might have disappeared because Paul, he really didn't travel outside. As exceptional as an evangelist as he was, he didn't travel outside of the Roman Empire or the parameters of civilization. There's so much of the church of the world that is unchurched right now, so it's really incumbent upon us. Now, evangelism is it's not an option. You have to witness to all that you come across and all that you do. Now, this doesn't mean you have to preach with words, but you can always preach with your actions. If you're at work, if it's bad for worker morale, you can't be you have to do what you're supposed to do. But if people notice kindness and courteousness and they'll one day ask you, what's your secret? And then you can tell them right there. And you may not know this, but you are empowered. You have the power of the of the Ruach Kadesh available at prayer. And maybe there's something in your background, your character. Maybe it's a spark of curiosity. Maybe it's divine providence that got you here. But I'm glad you made it this far. If you made it this far, that means you're interested in the faith, and you got to keep it growing. The object is to know more, but you got to know what you know before you say what you say. And that's ultimately all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Bye bye.